rotation. Questions?
Hello, everybody. Here we are for our final question and answer session. I have to say, after today, I'm very sad, and I'm tempted to extend us one more day. Not gonna happen. I do want to, first, we had a request to see how, so we've asked earlier how many extension agents, how many farmers. I know that a lot of our high school students did just have to leave because their school buses are on a schedule. But of those who are left, could you stand if you are K-12, if you're middle school, high school? Stand on up. And college students and educators, college level, university level, stand on up. Got a bunch of you in the audience. So for those high school students who may still have to be easing out the door, remember that we do archive all of this, and you can watch the very end at home later. So I'm going to start with some questions from the audience. We have been starting with the speakers asking each other questions, but we have so many good questions coming from you that I'm going to start with those right now. So the first one here is for Dr. Gilbert. How does what you know about the interaction of human bodies with other microbiomes affect how you raise your kids?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm a parent still, right? So the easiest way imaginable. I'll tell you what I have done. I've educated my kids that the reason we eat certain types of food is not necessarily for our own health directly, but for the health of the little farm of microbes that live in your intestine. And if you don't want Bo Diggly to die from not feeding him the right kind of food, then don't let your microbes die as well. And it sounds hyperbolic, but when you convince a 5-year-old to eat lots of lettuce and cucumber and tomatoes, that's got to be a good thing, right? There's no other real reason for eating lettuce other than feeding bacteria in your intestine. And about health and diet and generally, and they come to a lot of these talks that I do, and they sit here and they could walk on stage, and and they learn, and they hear people asking questions, and they see answers, and they see discourse. So getting them to think about their actions and what it means for their health has been absolutely key, and getting them to hang about with the dog. We turned over, thanks to Dave and his wife, we turned over a large portion of our backyard as well to prairie, which all the organic material goes from that straight back into the soil. And they play an active role in doing that as well. So, I mean, we're privileged. I have not only white and male privilege, but I also have an English accent, which makes me very privileged. But I would like to see other strategies to allow other children from unprivileged backgrounds, especially in South Chicago, where a vast proportion of our fellow humans are extremely underprivileged, to have access to that kind of opportunity as well. So I support enterprises that bring urban farms into the community, that do educational programs. I give my time freely for educational points in that area, and I encourage everybody to do the same. The best medicine for our society is education and providing people with opportunity.
I have a question for Dr. Simard. How does your understanding of indigenous and scientific knowledge systems apply to the debate about how to manage soil health? So,
small question.
Yeah, small question. Bring it all together.
Small one. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
That's a really good question. So this idea of balance is hugely important, that finding balance in the ecosystem means balance among all of the trophic levels. So trophic levels from the wolves to the grizzly bears, to the herbivores, the deer, the moose, to the primary producers, the trees, and then down into the below-ground food web, which goes from, again, the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on, is that there's got to be balance between all of those trophic levels. And in order to do that, we have to maintain the connections. And that's where my Aboriginal colleagues and I come together in trying to honor those connections, keeping the connections and relationships intact. So it's not just having the species there, it's how they interact with each other that is the magical part. And it's out of that interaction that you get things like healthy forests. And so we, especially also looking at the human interaction with those ecosystems, oftentimes we take ourselves out of the ecosystem. And what the Aboriginal people have really taught me is that we are integral, important, huge parts of ecosystems. And when we start seeing ourselves removed, that's when things fall apart. When we don't actively engage with our environment and we don't understand it, and we start doing things to it, that's when we make mistakes. And so the Aboriginal people have taught me, they live right in their ecosystems, they're attuned to them, and they respond to them. They're constantly getting that feedback from the system themselves. And so, I've always I've always felt that and known that, but not really seen it to the extent that now I really see it, and how the abundance that can come from that kind of relationship. I think that a lot of people, and I ask my students this, I say, how do you view your relationship with the environment? Do you view it as a positive or a negative thing? And almost always the students will say negative, right? We think that the human impact on the environment is negative, and we see that around us, but we need to change our way of thinking, that we become part of the positive interactions, and so the Aboriginal people that's how they live their lives, and out of that created great wealth, especially, of course, the evidence I see along the West Coast with the salmon fishery is an amazing example of that.
I know others of you have thought about that too. Do others of you want to chime in about bringing different sources of knowledge or ways of knowing into your work? I know.
Do you sense kind of a hint of humility that the soil teaches you here in these interactions? I mean, I must confess,
pick up just a little bit.
I am wondering whether your story teaches a sense of humility, that there is something out there in nature that for all the effort that we can put into this, we will never quite crunch down, let alone quantify in the kind of language of academic science that we embrace. I asked you earlier, when the mics were off, is there mystery in the soil for you?
Of course.
I've never heard a scientist say that.
That's what makes it so interesting. And when we talk about complexity and the emergence of these higher level things, that includes the mystery. And so, there's things we're never going to know, and there's things that emerges out of it that's unpredictable. Somebody mentioned chaos. Chaos is one of those things, and I don't think we can ever, if we think that we can predict everything, we're wrong. But what we can do is that we can keep all the parts together, as Aldo Leopold said, keep all the parts there so that the interactions then we know that they can thrive. At least we know that.
Suzanne.
Yes, maybe I never had the opportunity like you to try to pay attention to other cultures and integrate them in my research. What I think I am influenced by is more related to culture and art is beauty, trying to incorporate beauty in my work. I did a lot in the first part of my career, I was studying the microbial habitat with lots of visualization techniques, and to be honest, what drove me is that it's so beautiful. I was excited, and it gave me ideas just to see beautiful things. And still now, and I try to encourage students, a beautiful demonstration. Something you do as a scientist can be elegant or not. And for me, it helps to try to fashion the way I work.
Yeah. Ray, you had your...
Yeah. I've been a big fan of Susan's work, and I use some of my videos to teach the producers. See, as an agronomist, as an ex-agronomist, become an agroecologist, see, we were taught in school competition. Competition, competition, competition. In fact, farmers will say, oh, the weeds are competing, these other plants are competing, to take up my nutrients. And I was trying to, when we teach the farmers, no, it's collaboration. Nature overall is collaborative. Does competition happen? Yes, but to build integrity within the system. But overall, when you look at Susan's work and you started seeing it, it's collaborated, and I showed the videos to the producers, I said, this is happening with your legumes and your corn. They're like, whoa, it just opened a different world. Because, see, we were taught we have to be the aggressor, we have to take control. Everything's trying to take my crop. Everything's trying to work against it. And so the elegance of your work is saying, no, look, it's collaborative. And even humans under really stressful conditions, if you watch, when we had the major floods in Houston through the big hurricane, every race, every group helped each other and collaborated. So it's teaching people collaboration and telling them the beauty and the elegance. I think that's where we have to go.
Yeah.
And again, education, it's really critical.
Ratan, yeah.
First of all, Suzanne and Jack, those are outstanding presentations.
Yeah.
I learned many new things. And I do want you to know that I honestly learned many things.
Thank you.
Suzanne, I just wanted to ask you, now that you taught us that the trees communicate with one another, they also recognize the kinship.
Yes.
Is it possible that we can decipher that molecular language or whatever it is so that we also learn how to be symbiotic with them?
Yeah, I think I understand what you were saying. I think that is such a fascinating question. And some people are working on this. So, we interact with the forest all the time. We can go in with malevolent intentions or benevolent intentions. We can go in with the intention of taking it down or helping it. And if they can interact with each other in these highly sophisticated ways, I'm pretty sure that they know, what our intentions are, especially when we go and do something to those trees. And I haven't actually gone and measured it. I've measured these other things, but that would be next on my list, is to go in with a different intention, and then what is the response? Yeah, excellent question.
I love that. Can you talk to the tree people in their own language?
Yes.
That'd be phenomenally cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question, how does the microbial world relate to soil health and prevention of soil erosion? Maybe, do you want to start with that, Jack?
I think we dealt with that a lot over the last couple of days, and Ray was talking about his cottage cheese, or whatever it was, the biological materials that life exudes that can bind together the soils can have a big impact upon drainage. So, yeah, the experiment that you showed in your video, where you're looking awesome, by the way. When you've got biological life there, the soil doesn't break down, right water can pass through it, it doesn't cause runoff, it doesn't cause compacting, so very much in that way.
I can add something to that. So, then that when we take those networks in the soil and we run them out in one big line, that in an area of soil like the size of this desk, there's about 300 kilometers of mycelium. Mm-hmm. And so all that mycelium is covered with bacteria, biofilms, and so you can imagine all the glue that is holding that soil together. So that is what prevents erosion, is having that healthy mycelium with its microbial biofilms and all the creatures that feed off of it, healthy, and they hold the grains together, prevent erosion.
Ratan and then Jack, or Ray.
Well, one thing a lot of farmers, when they see that, it just messes with their minds. And then what I have the farmer do is open that big clod, and it's completely soaked. And they're shocked, because one farmer said, now, Ray, you put a boulder in there. Because that's what they did. They thought it was actually, but it was interesting. When we have those super cementing agents, those biotic glues, they hold the tractor up. Now, center pivots that have all this lot of weight, they don't have a less. They hold the center pivot, the weights. The farmers can get on the fields sooner to plant because of those biotic substances and their super glues, the structure. So it's pretty darn exciting to have that.
Ratan, you had.
Jack, we know that soils are source of antibiotics, 95% of them. We know they are source of micronutrients. We also know they are source of heavy metals, which cause problem. Are there other things that soils can cause pathogenic problem, pathological, that we should be aware of and make sure that we guard us against them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've got very good in our society about preventing disease, right? There are major pathogenic organisms spread from people to people, but in every system there's always going to be emerging pathogens. In our group we work with bats, and bats and their interaction with the soil and the plant life around them are a wonderful, well, not so wonderful, hub for virus infections. Everything from Ebola to emerging other infections like HIV probably had a bat reservoir. So our understanding of how animals and the soil interact, especially in places where people aren't normally found, but are currently rapidly encroaching into due to deforestation and rapid agriculturalization of those environments, puts people at risk of exposure to infections which they wouldn't otherwise normally have seen in our population. So there is definitely a need for surveillance of those properties, and groups down at the CDC and various other agencies that are there to provide that surveillance do a immeasurably good job, and a job which is totally and utterly not, nobody says, wow, what a good job they're doing. Everyone just goes, the CDC is shadowy agency. But there's unsung heroes in all of those federal agencies, including the Soil Service, working to actually help people to generate data, to create an infrastructure where we can actually operationalize our lives. And the CDC is a great example of that. They are doing soil surveillance for pathogens which could have implications for human health.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
One question for Jack. We have been talking about aggregates. Aggregates are a small part of the universe in this universe Underfoot, with small pores, large pores, big pieces of organic matter, so food, not food. So it's very heterogeneous, actually. It's a world in the world. And so you are interested in biogeography at a very large scale. How does it compare to biogeography at a much smaller scale?
If we took prairie soils and we divided them into 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter plots, for the Americans in the audience, that's like, I don't know.
4 inches?
No, not 12, no. Like 4 inches, there we are, sorry, Ratan. 4 of your imperial inches, you still can't get rid of the king. So yes, you've got 4 inches by 4 inches, and we took samples of the soil every centimeter through that plot, and if I take a sample core here, I'll see a hyperabundance of Verrucomicrobia and virtually no proteobacteria. If I go 1 centimeter over, lots of proteobacteria, virtually no Verrucomicrobia.
As diverse as between China and Javanese islands. Wow.
What's interesting is if I look at your, this is going to sound weird and slightly out of sync, but if I take the microbiome from the Serengeti, the soils of the Serengeti, and I take the microbiome living on coral polyps in the South Pacific, the difference between those microbial communities is as big as the difference between your oral microbiome and the microbiome in your hand. Unless you've been licking your hand. Like, now it's the same. Right? But that's a huge ecosystem difference. So even on that very small scale, we can see differences in communities which are as great as differences over tens of thousands of miles. And the same is true for soils. But the beauty of it is a grassland soil, despite all of that heterogeneity, is always identifiable as a grassland soil. It looks different to a forest soil. It looks different to an agricultural soil or a desert soil. They are different ecosystems.
I never met Jack before, and I heard his presentation, and I was like ecstatic. One particular point, all of it, but this point really resonated with me because my job is also to restore, we're getting cropland and going back into prairie systems, and how to restore them without being so costly. A lot of people don't realize prairie grasses and all those native grasses are very, very expensive, extremely expensive. And so for the last 2 or 3, 4 years, intuitively, what we've been doing is when we get a farmer to start, because remember, these are heavily tilled, bacteria-dominant soils, lots of nitrate in them, we started putting 2 years of cover crops, multi-species that look like prairie, before we even plant the grasses, knowing that we're pumping way more carbon, bringing it into the system, and get it restored. Your work reaffirmed some of the stuff we were doing, and I got all excited. I said, Jack, we got to talk some more. Because it can cost millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars to go into restoration. Your work can help us do it quicker without spending so much on seed and work and labor. So I applaud you on that work.
Just need some microbial pandas. We're going to farm them.
Yep.
Dave, did you want to?
Yeah, well, Ray just mentioned starting doing 2 years of cover crops and something. And
Yeah.
actually, Ann and I spent part of this summer running samples through a friend's mass spec in our oceanography department, just looking at wheat grains grown in 2 neighboring fields in southern Washington that we looked at the mineral micronutrient content of the wheat. And we know historically that we've had great reductions in the mineral micronutrients in many of our major food crops. And there's lots of arguments over how that happened and so forth. I won't go into that. But what I was amazed by is that this experiment, 2 side-by-side fields, one that had been, they were both no-till. The difference was one had cover crops for 2 years and the other had herbicides for 2 years. Think we saw a difference? There was about a 30 to 50% difference in a number of the major important mineral micronutrients for human health in the wheat that came out of those fields. Wow. And this is in 2 years. You don't change the chemistry of the soil in 2 years. But what can you change? The microbial ecosystem. So we're trying to embark on a bigger project to try and look at those kind of differences, because the potential to transform human nutrition in different parts of the world, to understand that complex world in the soil and to get it right, or to change the way that we're thinking about it in our management is potentially quite huge.
We can accelerate it through soil probiotics. What's wrong with that concept, right? People are doing it right now. Those companies I was talking about at the end. It's a good way of rapidly fuel injecting the system.
Yeah, and you could also do it with prebiotics.
Prebiotics,
which is what they were doing with the cover crops. And so the analogies between the human system, where pre and probiotics, they both work but for different things, and figuring out how to make it work in an agricultural environment, it could work the same.
So a probiotic or a prebiotic being something you add proactively.
Now, a probiotic is an organism that it has a very specific definition, and definitions are important, accuracy is important. A probiotic is something I add into Rattan's diet to make him have to improve his health. It has to have a measurable impact upon health benefit. It's obviously abused, because there are a lot of probiotics you can buy out there which do not have a measurable health impact unless you're very, very sick. But and a prebiotic is something which is a food which is specifically designed to feed the bacteria in the gut. And we call it symbiotic when we combine those two. So a probiotic and a prebiotic is a symbiotic.
And let me add another one. I have a question about antibiotics. How does antibiotic usage in medicine and agriculture affect the soil microbiome?
There's an ongoing experiment on that in Florida at the moment, where we're spraying antibiotics onto the citrus crop in order to protect it from potential infections. And we don't know. Trust me when I say this, there is a huge amount of industrial interest in this. If they can figure out ways to prevent the damage to the soil, they will make a lot of money out of selling products to help people recover their soils after antibiotic contamination. But I honestly think there's a role to play in preventing that from happening in the first place, and a role to play in helping to clean up after those events. But we honestly do not know the damage that seeding soils with antibiotics to treat plant infections will actually have in the long run.
Professor?
First of all, I want to take your offer, thankfully, for improving my health. I greatly appreciate it. We have been separating grassland soil from forest soil through C3 and C4 plants, which I'm sure our ecology students know that. Now you're telling me that we can also separate them from microbiome.
Yeah.
Specific microbial activity.
So microbial communities, very different, yeah.
And that is specified for each species of steppes versus forest versus savanna versus
different forests will have identifiable, predictable microbial communities. Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm going to turn back to Dr. Simard. Can we maintain the forest connections while doing forest management, like selective logging? Are there ways?
Yeah. I think, so if you clear cut a forest, for example, or take the trees away, so a bunch of things happen. So for one, you know, the photosynthesis, photosynthate that drives the energy cycle of that system is definitely compromised because the trees are the foundation of the forest. And so once the trees are gone and the photosynthate, then the mycorrhizas die off within a year or two. But you can maintain the mycorrhizas in the soil if you leave a few trees, or you have plants that are native plants that are growing back. And if you plant or regenerate that forest fairly quickly, then that inoculum that's still in the soil for a year or two, they can hook into that inoculum. But there are changes. So, for example, when trees are young, they have a different suite of mycorrhizal fungi than when they're older. So the fungal community changes over time. So an old-growth forest has got a more diverse suite of fungi than a young forest, and it's also got it's more diverse, and it's a different kinds of fungi. So they tend to be fungi that require a lot of carbon to maintain because they're off doing, you know, different things, accessing soil aggregates in different ways to get at scarce resources. They all have different jobs to do that, and as a forest gets older, it gets harder and harder to do that because things are just more tightly bound. So when the old trees are gone, then we convert to these younger, more ruderal species, these weedy species. So what you can do in order to maintain that diversity and to keep the suite of fungi that are there in an old forest, that high diversity of old-growth fungi, is to keep some old trees on the site. So keeping old plants that are houses of that old biodiversity. And then when you have that, you have greater functionality in the ecosystem. When you convert it to something that's a plantation and even, goodness forbid, bare soil, it changes everything. The community, the network collapses. It can reform around the new plants, but it's a completely different kind of network. It's made of more weedy species that are fine and don't have the same functions.
So I have one more question here, and then I'm going to let you all talk about, are there things kind of final messages or final conversation you want to have amongst yourselves? So think about that.
And I'm claiming prerogative. So I'm compelled by, this is kind of a question that comes out of the same spirit of Professor Euclid's presentation, I think, and it's a question about the ways in which we conceptualize the work that we're doing. I'm really compelled by and moved by discussions about reciprocity and commensality and interconnection and helper mother trees. It's wonderful. All of these concepts are really interesting. And I'm also really compelled by the work of Ed Yong, who writes about the way, well, one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about lately is his statement that, in fact, more organisms spend at least part of their life as parasitic than as any other life form. I've been thinking and working in my own philosophy for the last few years about parasitism as a relationship of this kind of very dynamic imbalance. And so I'm wondering if our pendulum is about to swing dangerously far in the direction of commensality and reciprocity and being kind to each other. And perhaps we need some grit in the wheels, to mix my metaphors hopelessly. I'm going to stop now because God knows where I'll go next. So any of you, that's open for any of you, because I think all of you in one way or another have maybe explored some of that language. Maybe not you, Jack. There was a lot of dirt talk in your talk.
I got a lot of grit in my wheels. If I'm understanding you correctly, then yeah, we need some of the what Ray was saying, and you know, what we've heard from other people. We need something which will actually affect the system from the outside, that will keep it fresh and young.
Well, and partly what I'm saying is when we look around us, we see, my description is it's chomping all the way down, right? Maybe it's not competition, but I'm concerned about the swing of the pendulum over to a kind of quiescence.
Right.
In our language. I'm not saying that's happening in nature, right? I'm saying we're adopting that language in a way that I'm worried is too wholehearted, perhaps.
Yeah, you need a bit of tooth and claw to keep the ecosystem working, right? I mean, I would
hanging on and sucking, maybe.
Symbiosis is a form of communal competition.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm not sure I understand the question, because I mean, there's.
Well, the language of it seems to me that the language of reciprocity can invite us, and perhaps mostly us who come to the word symbiosis from another discipline altogether, we can tend to understand and think in terms of, kumbaya, as we might say. That is a kind of great coming together, and, even Suzanne, your work that emphasizes a tree recognizing another tree as being stressed and providing for it. How does that, is there a pendulum swing danger there?
I think,
and maybe not.
Yeah, I think, I'm not completely sure I understand what your question was, but human beings have a tendency to swing, right? Mm-hmm. We either go this way or we go that way. It's like we're always looking for that silver bullet. I think in forestry, we're very guilty of that, and I think from what I hear in agriculture also, is that we look for a solution in that one thing. In forestry, it was, clear cut, plant trees, get rid of the weeds, and we've got, everything will be great, without having to look at the complexity of it. And so the thing that to swing back away from that simple thinking, whether it's all competition or all cooperation, no, it's not that. It's a multiplicity of interactions, and it's the balance of that multiplicity. And, symbiosis includes competition and cooperation and parasitism and proto-cooperation and immense the whole suite of interactions are important. And when we do, focus on just one, that's when we get into trouble.
Can I riff on that slightly? Because I am getting it. Stable states, right? When you talk about ecological stable states, you talk about a ball sitting in a valley, and if it takes a lot of energy to push it out of the valley and into another valley, it's a really stable state, right? If you just have to flick it gently and it goes straight out of the valley and into a new valley, and it's not a very stable state, the ecosystem can change dramatically. To riff off of humans, if you're obese, I can take the poop from an obese person and put it into a mouse, and the mouse will now gain weight. There's something about the ecosystem you created in the gut, which means that mouse cannot help but put on weight. If I have to put the human on a diet for 9 months to make their microbiome, their ecosystem, their stable state in their community now be not obese promoting. So I could take it after 9 months, take it out of them, put it in a mouse. The mouse will have a normal relationship with weight, right? And so there is a relationship. Maybe if we get too close towards a stable state where we are missing certain keystone species, or we have lost the diversity that allows for that competitive reciprocity, maybe we get into a stable state that's not stable anymore.
Or it's a negative stable state.
Right, exactly.
A dangerous stable state.
An unhealthy state that's really, either really strong and we can't get out of it, or it just keeps on oscillating backwards and forwards, creating unpredictable chaos, which will be also damaging.
My question was really about the ways in which we talk, and I'm wondering, Frank, if you...
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that we're probably moving into a kind of a post-paradigmatic stage here of our reflection, which is a good thing because we used to have a paradigm for the soil, that the paradigm of agrochemistry, the soil as just a storage plate of nutrients on the way from the factory into the plant. That's what we had, and we know that this was terribly insufficient and terribly damaging. So I think the challenge here is to have these multiplicity of approaches and views with all the inherent limits, and just accept this multiplicity of pathways and not fall back into this rigid grid of an older science.
Does someone have a conversation they want to throw out there?
Dave and I are working on our new album, Two Flies Humping.
Yeah, so I heard that. That sounds
sorry,
amazing.
he's going to throw out a lyric. I'm going to... No.
We'll get it out next summer, right?
Just watch out for it, guys.
Lovely. Rattan, you had a question?
Yes, during the lunch break, I was asked a question to make a few comments about the Green Revolution.
The Green Revolution.
I'll take a couple of minutes. The Green Revolution of the 60s and 70s was something that was God sent at that time. The food production in South Asia, in Central America, elsewhere, increased dramatically. It saved hundreds of millions of people from starvation. So we are thankful for that. I think we must acknowledge that part first. Now we are 40, 50 years after. We have abused the technology. That's not fault of the Green Revolution. Green Revolution did not say indiscriminate use of pesticides. indiscriminate use of herbicides, indiscriminate use of fertilizer, indiscriminate excessive irrigation. It did not say that. We are doing it. That is a technology without wisdom. We must stop that.
Yeah.
If we got 5 seconds, because I've been dying to ask him a question
Oh.
since like day one,
Yeah.
which was not very long ago, admittedly. You mentioned, and everyone else mentioned, right, that in the developing communities, right, and we know this in sub-Saharan Africa, we know this in certain parts of India, and rural India, and even in rural China, it's very hard for people to give up the organic matter and put it back into the soil because they use it for other things. Biochar aside, which means burning some wood, you still have a limitation of that. So I have not yet heard a good solution to that major problem, which supports some 2.5, 2.7 billion people.
Very good question indeed. And as you know, last year in New Delhi, you can't land the planes because of the smoke.
Yeah.
Where did that smoke come from? All the farmers around burning rice straw, because they have only 2 or 3 weeks to sow the wheat. Every single day delay after 20th of October, there is a 100 kilogram decline in crop yield. They have no technology to get that cut through the rice straw. So they burn the rice straw. How are you going to stop it? The question is, you require, like John Deere, Alice Chalmers, Fiat Alice, special seed drill. We saw that cuts through the wet crop residue. A seed drill costs $150,000.
Yeah, who's going to buy it?
Somebody who's going to buy it.
Yeah.
So that is where a government policy has to intervene. Why not they buy those machines and rent that to them? The other part, I was asked that question, what the solution to this smoke? The solution, another solution is provide clean cooking fuel to the rural housewives. Right now, health-wise, that's a disaster. A young mother and children sitting around a fire, being burnt with their dung, crop residue, another biomass, inhaling those obnoxious fumes,
The levels of
unburnt at a
asthma,
level which is absolutely
emphysema.
not acceptable. This is where the policy intervention, policy with relevance, is very critical, absolutely critical. And this is where the dialogue between scientist and policymaker is very critical. It can be done, and it should be done.
So that's going to lead to my last question, which is for each of you, and it's a question we've been getting a lot today and yesterday. You are all teachers, so I imagine you all have some message for the young people. The question that I'm getting in various forms is, what can I do now? And so if you have your 1-minute version or 2-minute message, I would love to have you share that. Does anyone want to go first?
Rip up your parents' lawn and start planting with local plants.
Okay.
What I would do.
Others? Frank, did you?
Well,
I think we're,
humanity is always more complicated, but I'm a bit overwhelmed here by the complexity of on the podium, and I do appreciate that. I mean, the simple answers are not always the best answers, but there's, I think, one important thing. Do not let complexity disturb you as you try to search for solutions and paths to the future. We need that, and I think the only way to get these paths in the future is to have people to take the courage and come forward with concrete concepts that may change the world.
Ratan.
First of all, I want to mention that this conference to me, in 50 years of my professional experience, is unique. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I also want to mention this afternoon I had an opportunity to have a lunch with the high school students, and that's an excellent approach. You brought high school students to listen. This is where you catch the best and the brightest to come to us. I want to specifically mention one example today in that experience. Somebody came up with a question, will I still be Christian if I did this? And my immediate response was, if Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, Sikhism, whatever religion, if they follow their religion perfectly, right to the last letter, they can never make a mistake.
Right.
All religion says, protect the nature. It is only when we distort them, we create the problems. So that education of students to telling them that it's the path of truth that we must follow, doesn't matter what you believe in, is very critical. Thank you.
Claire?
Oh, maybe I'll advise, well, to look around you, think it over, and there are so many challenges. Challenges regarding soils, we have been talking about that for 2 days, but also nature, preserving nature, but also our society. Our societies are not functioning well in terms of relationships, of respect and others. So what I would advise maybe is to be brave enough to dare to do small things, but do them. Choose several and go ahead, even if it's small, go ahead.
Anybody?
Well, I talk to people of all ages, and my students are about 20, my kids are about 20. I talk to kids that are 6 and 5, and I talk to old people that are, like my mom is 83. And the questions are just as sophisticated when you're 3 and 5 as they are when you're 85. All of you have really important questions in your minds, and don't ever shut it down, right? Like, be inquisitive, and because we don't know all the answers at all. We're not even close to knowing. So the only, in order to honor the earth and respect and to be responsible for the earth, all those things are part of our package of what we do. And in order to do that, the best you can is to keep your mind open, because you have all the right, you've got the questions there in your heads. You've got it in your hearts, and you just need to keep open and keep asking the questions. Mm-hmm. Trust in it. Yeah.
Well, this conference is about the soil, and I would encourage everyone to think about the soil, because the way that sort of we're thinking about it on the cutting edge of research is really different than the way most of us were trained to think about it. It's something that has been changing in our lifetimes. If you want to live through a scientific revolution, marry what Jack's doing to the soil. I mean, this is really, really new. And it's exciting, and it's interesting, and it can change the way we think about agriculture and medicine. And there's things that you can do in your yard, in your home, in thinking about where your food comes from, in insisting that your food is grown in ways that actually heal the earth rather than degrade the earth. That would be revolutionary. And, rebuilding soil fertility is not the most important problem we face. It's never been the most important problem we face. Those are usually day-to-day problems for all of us. But some of the really big challenges we face as societies, as civilizations, dare I say, are things like fresh water, like the atmosphere, like the soil, the things that sustain us as peoples and villages and cities and societies as a global community. These are important challenges. We need to figure out how they work. We need to figure out better ways of doing things, keep an open mind, learn as we go, all those kinds of things. But we shouldn't forget the big challenges, even if they're right underfoot and we take them for granted most of the time.
Well, let me tell you, I think everyone here is here because of passion. And I think they have a love for the science, love for people, love for the land. I think if I had to say one thing, I think that if we're going to change this planet, we're really going to have to focus on making sure that we do it in a way of love and compassion for people. Because love gives you that barrier to listen to other people that don't agree with you. Or be patient when farmers, for example, some of the farmers go through a lot of stress. But they show the love and kindness for those who are maybe mocking them because they're doing cover crops or they're doing something, but yet they're gracious enough to share their information. For a long time, if people ask me, well, Ray, can one person make a difference? And I would say, just to be positive, oh yeah, sure. I believe it now. I really believe every one of us serve purpose. We do. And when I told those young students what I was so impressed, we sat together, I said, do your calling, know your why. When you do that, you know why you're here, why God put you here, and what purpose. You can be an incredible force. We can heal this planet. I really believe that. And I think sometimes you can look at the peripheral and say, man, it doesn't look good. It can be really negative. But I tell you, when I came back from Chihuahua, Mexico, and I saw the land become healed, it gave me great hope. Okay. We can do this, and I'm so excited teaching this in our churches, our school. Many times I've gone to sermons and heard no talk about restoration of the land and healing of the land. Rarely that's ever talked about. I think we need to change that. It needs to be in our schools, our grade schools, high schools, everywhere. I think we need to make an awareness. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Ray. And I would add, for those of you looking to know what to do, is that part of your challenge is to know that you actually know your community best. You know your context best. So I would say do what you know, work with the people you know, and use approaches that feed off of your own personal strengths. If we are all working within our own sphere, that will be powerful, and that will be a good path. So thank you for coming.
So thanks to all of you, again, for coming to Nobel Conference 54. One last thanks for our panelists, and also for Laura Triplett and James Danche for their wonderful coordination of this. Drive very safely home, please, and please be back here next year for Climate Changed. Thank you.